NACDL is the association of the nation's criminal defense bar.
Good afternoon. I'm Monica Milton, Public Defense Counsel for NACDL. This webinar series is presented by NACDL and co-sponsored by the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys. It's also supported by a grant from DOJ's Bureau of Justice Assistance. Although BJA's funding for training to prevent and remedy wrongful convictions supports this program, DOJ and BJA do not endorse, support, or review the content, so the views and information presented do not necessarily reflect the positions of the DOJ. With that said, I want to welcome you to our program, Progressive Prosecutors, Challenges and Opportunities for Defenders. So just some room rules. As you may have noticed, everyone but the panelists and moderator are automatically muted and their cameras are turned off. You can turn your cameras on or unmute yourselves. So if you have questions for the panelists, we ask that you use the Q&A function. Questions involving tech issues, please use the chat function. We will be monitoring the messages and we'll do our best to get to as many questions as we can, with bearing in mind that this is a 90-minute program, so we'll do our best. This program is being recorded and will be made available on our website for future viewing and sharing outside of our paywall. So I'm just going to introduce our moderator, Tony Thedford. He is a career-long criminal defense attorney who is now at Thedford Garber Law, a Chicago criminal defense and civil rights firm. Tony began his legal career as a Cook County public defender, where he served for 8 years before starting his own law practice. He also serves on NACDL's board of directors. So with that said, Tony, I'll let you take it over.
Thank you very much, Monica. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, as Monica just indicated, I am Tony Thedford. I hope to not do too much talking here because we have an amazing panel of accomplished attorneys who I think can drive this better than I. So I will try to stay out of the way and make sure that I, first of all, get all of your questions answered as you ask them, and as well as allow our panelists to have the floor. I want to begin with introductions of each of our panelists. I want to begin, first of all, introducing Natasha Dartique, who's a deputy defender in Baltimore, Maryland. Natasha, please give us a biography of yourself, if you will, and let us know a little bit about what you do and why you're here.
Thanks, Tony. Hi, everyone. My name is Natasha Dartique. I serve as the Deputy District Public Defender for Baltimore City. I am a graduate of the Howard University School of Law. I started my career in Baltimore as a clerk for the late Judge Roger Brown in 1995. After my clerkship, I entered the Public Defender's Office in Baltimore City in the Juvenile Division. I've had the opportunity to work in each of our divisions here in Baltimore City. I assumed my position as deputy in 2017. As deputy, I serve in terms of staff development and community outreach. Those are my two main areas in which I serve under Kirsten Downs, who is the public defender for Baltimore City. What was your other question, Tony?
No, I think that gets it for us. We're going to obviously come back to you later so you can fill in some more blanks for us. Our second panelist is a colleague of mine who serves on the board for NACDL, along with myself and many others. Marissa Elkins. Marissa, can you give us a short rundown of who you are and why you're here?
Sure. Hi, Tony. As he said, I'm Marissa Elkins. I'm with Elkins, Auer, Rudolph, and Schiff, a firm in Western Massachusetts. I think I'm here because I do court-appointed, so I do public defense, but I do it under the rubric of being a private attorney that does court-appointed work. I do court-appointed work on the state side, mostly at this point major felonies and murder cases. And because I'm in Western Massachusetts, I actually mainly practice in 3 jurisdictions. So I have many of my cases come out of Hampden County, in Western Massachusetts, which is a majority minority urban community for the most part, with a very not progressive prosecutor. My county is a district attorney who has always been liberal, presented himself as liberal. He is, but was elected before the progressive prosecutor movement, and he has jumped on that bandwagon, at least in rhetoric, and it's up for debate to what degree that's been the case in practice. And then and mine is a sort of urban, a suburban kind of county. And then I practice in Berkshire County, which is very much a rural, not very diverse community, but that just recently elected somebody who ran, Andrea Harrington, who ran as an avowed sort of progressive prosecutor. So that I come with sort of a perspective of practicing across a few different jurisdictions that are approaching things very differently.
Thanks. Thank you, Marissa. Our final panelist is Mr. Wesley Bell. Wesley is a prosecuting attorney in St. Louis, Missouri. Good afternoon, Wesley.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me. Did you want me to do the same thing, kind of?
Please do, sir.
Quick introduction. No, it's good to be here. Yeah, again, my name is Wesley Bell. I'm the St. Louis County prosecuting attorney, which is different from St. Louis City. We have a unique dynamic here. So the city prosecutor is the circuit attorney, and so we represent the county, roughly 1 million people in St. Louis County. I started my career as a public defender as well for the Missouri State Public Defender's Office, actually the Special Public Defender's Office, where we did conflict cases for the entire region. And then for years, I had a private practice where I did primarily defense work. And in 2015, about 9 months after Ferguson became Ferguson, I was elected to the Ferguson City Council and got an opportunity to work with President Obama's Department of Justice on the Ferguson consent decree, bringing community policing and some of the most broad court reforms in the region. In 2019, I ran against the incumbent who had been here for 28 years, and he was the prosecutor when Michael Brown was killed, and the way that was handled came under a lot of criticism. But having said that, I did defeat him, and so I took office January 1st, 2019, and I know Andrea Harrington. She's part of an organization that I've been aligned with, Fair and Just Prosecution, as well as Natasha. I think Maryland. Are you in? I think you're in Baltimore. So that Marilyn Mosby was a good friend of mine as well, and Tony Kim Fox, who was also a good friend, and I think all of them, from my understanding, especially Marilyn, I know much more, and Kim, I know them much more. They are progressive-minded prosecutors as well, and I know we'll probably talk about that through the program.
Wesley, thank you so much. It's great to meet you. And you've given us a perfect segue, because that's what we're here to talk about. Over the past approximately 10 years, certainly over the last several years, there has been a movement, frankly, in response to many of the atrocities or the over-prosecution, as it were, of communities, certainly large communities in our country. We have seen the rise in progressive prosecutors who run on a platform of reform. What does that mean? I would like to ask each of the panelists what progressive prosecution, how you would define it in terms of how it looks for real in your practice. Natasha, we'll start with you, and I'd like to end this with Wesley, so I'll go in the same order because the perspectives are a little bit different here, but I think fascinating, each of them. Go ahead, Natasha. And Natasha, I want to mention, Natasha is in the jurisdiction where Marilyn Mosby is the prosecutor, and she was a prosecutor and dealt with the Freddie Gray matter, correct?
That is correct, yes.
Go ahead.
Yes,
Natasha.
So, so you start with me, but I would first say that I don't necessarily adopt the term progressive prosecutor. And I say that primarily because the role of the prosecutor has certain specific responsibilities. All attorneys are under the rules of professional responsibility. And especially prosecutors, they have additional responsibilities, which include not going forth with cases in which there's no probable cause. If you have evidence that in fact an individual who perhaps was convicted, was wrongfully convicted, you have a duty to undo that conviction, and so forth. And when I speak about the rules of professional responsibility, that is the baseline. That is the absolute minimum on which prosecutors are supposed to operate. So when I see prosecutors, and I'll use my own prosecutor as an example, Marilyn Mosby, doing certain things, I just interpreted that she's read the rule book. She, at least to a basic level, she understands some of her responsibilities. So I wouldn't necessarily tout her as being progressive. I don't necessarily use that term because what people are recognizing as progressive now is the baseline basic things that prosecutors are supposed to do based upon their professional responsibility.
Interesting perspective, Natasha. Can you define then what the prior prosecutor was doing that did not meet the level, the baseline level of professional responsibilities you've just indicated? Give any examples, rather.
I guess I would speak more so in what Marilyn is doing that her predecessor did not. So Marilyn is engaging in more dialogue with the defense bar, with the public defender's office, in ways that her predecessor did not. And therefore, you will see more reforms, more things taking place through Marilyn's administration. So like, for example, we have the notorious GTTF, the Gun Trace Task Force. Those essentially those 8 officers that were federally indicted that operated as a criminal gang in Baltimore City. We had known about these officers for years. We had essentially touted the wrongdoings of these officers for years. It wasn't until after the incident of Freddie Gray's death, when the Department of Justice came to Baltimore, that this was fully revealed, and then investigations started to flow. But as a result of those officers being indicted and convicted, we had to essentially go back, because those officers were essential in convictions of hundreds and hundreds of people, right? So Marilyn's willingness to engage in dialogue when essentially we came to her with names of individuals who we believed were wrongfully convicted because these officers were involved in their cases, there were primaries. She was willing to engage in those discussions and move, and we were able to work in conjunction to move the process so that these individuals could get proper relief.
Yeah, there's been a lot of action in your area of the world, and so I'm glad that you're here, and it's very fascinating. Larissa, I'm sorry, go ahead.
And I would just add, Marilyn is definitely more connected to the community in ways that her predecessor Bernstein was not. I definitely give her a great deal of credit that she is more connected to the community of Baltimore City in ways her predecessor was not in at all.
I hear you. Marissa, same question for you. First of all, I'll have you define for yourself what progressive prosecution means to you, what it means in your region, and in your experiences, particularly with the newly elected prosecutor in one of the counties that you work out of. And also talk about your support vis-a-vis the election of that prosecutor that you shared with us earlier.
Well, so I share with Natasha the skepticism around the term progressive prosecutor for all the reasons that she described in a lot of ways. But in terms of sort of pragmatics and what it means on the ground, and for my clients in the courtroom, I think the things that I I see most in common with prosecutors who are reform-minded are announced policies that flow through to their assistant prosecutors, to their staff, that are decarcerative in nature. I think a real willingness to tackle head-on wrongful convictions for all kinds of reasons. So a retrospective view of their office's impact on the communities that they're in and what that means, and equal application of the law to everybody, which very much means questioning and holding themselves apart from the law enforcement community in their community, and viewing their role appropriately as separate from that. And so I don't sort of offer those as comprehensive in any way necessarily, but if I kind of had a group in general terms, some of the things that I think make the most difference for the communities that these prosecutors, for their constituents, I think I'd hone in on those things. I forgot the other part of your question, Tony.
It was do you have a relationship with your prosecutor, the newly elected prosecutor? I'm sorry, her name escapes me at this point, that you mentioned a moment ago.
Oh, Andrea Harrington.
Yes, sorry.
Well, and I would say there's two prosecutors that I who are the elected DAs that I would say I have that I know, and both through practice and in the community. So, and I'm here in the Northwestern region in Massachusetts, and that's David Sullivan is his name, and he's the one. I have a longer relationship with him, in the sense that I was a public defender when he ran, and he was well known in the community. Ran on some principles that certainly were better than what preceded him. But he was, but then in the last couple of years, I think he signed on to some of these organizations that are, Wesley, I'm not sure. He signed on to some letters and statements of various things, along with this list of progressive prosecutors that are working these issues. So I think he very much fancies himself as among in this. He would align himself with that. And certainly in how he speaks. Andrea Harrington, I met when she was running, or learned of when she was running. And I wouldn't say that I know her, and we've had some conversations. I didn't support her. I don't vote. I don't vote in her district. But she. But it has been interesting watching her navigate a pretty big sea shift in that county, in terms of it's the attitude of the court system in that office toward law enforcement and toward criminal justice in general. So I don't know if I have more to say about that at this point. I'll probably follow up, but
we're going to circle back to how that actually works for your clients in a moment. But I want to move to Attorney Bell. You are a progressive prosecutor. Tell us about that journey. And please include whether you believe that a progressive prosecutor would have to have looked at both sides, if they have to have had a defense lawyer background on some level in order to be able to claim progressive prosecutor status.
So I am one that tends to shy away from labels, because I do agree that a lot of it is relative. If you would have looked at someone in the 1850s who was against slavery, they were viewed as radical. We would call them humanitarian now. So I do understand that, but I think it's, and I'll start with the definition, my definition of a progressive-minded or reform-minded prosecutor. I think it's simply a prosecutor who recognizes that there has to be more tools in the toolbox at our disposals than just incarceration. I think we understand that incarceration doesn't keep us safer, and we have a history of, or a culture of prosecutors and law enforcement who, for the last few generations, have been making their reputations and staking their reputations on the number of people that they incarcerate. And so what I would say, and I say this respectfully in the sense of a dialogue, I would push back on not referring to some of these individuals as progressive minded or progressive prosecutors, because we have to look at when you're analyzing any industry, you have to look at what are most of the people doing. And the overwhelming majority of people, and I think upwards of 85% of prosecutors are not doing are implementing or supporting or advocating the reforms that many of us are. And I can look in my own state, there's 2 to 3 of us. The other 60 prosecutors are pretty much diametrically opposed to most of the things that we want to do. And so if you, into Natasha's point, yes, there's a baseline of reading the rules, as you would say, but there's a lot of things that are up to the respective prosecutor's discretion. And the decisions that are made are, the rule book gives the prosecutor broad discretion in a lot of these, with respect to a lot of these decisions, and having people who do see both sides of the coin. And I think it does help to have that experience. And I look for former defense attorneys when I hire, now that I've been here. I think it's important to understand that having people in those, occupying those spaces can reap meaningful benefits. And I'm a data person, so I want to, and a facts person, so I want to kind of talk about a couple things, and I'll close on these things. One, this is something that, and I've talked to Marilyn about this, Marilyn Mosby, as well as Andrea. I don't know Andrea as well, but I know Marilyn. And one thing that we've made a point to do is aggressively expand diversion programs, alternatives to incarceration. That's not in the rule book. We don't have to do that. When someone comes with a small amount of drugs, we can just prosecute them. That's actually in the rule book. But by saying, you know what, we're going to offer treatment services and mental health care as opposed to prosecution and as opposed to incarceration, I think where we stand now, that is reform minded compared to what 85% of prosecutors in law enforcement are doing across the country. In my jurisdiction, one thing that kept our jail numbers up is the prosecutor's office. Prior to me, the prosecutors, if there was any felonies and even many misdemeanors, warrants would be issued. And I think we all know on the panel, if you get a warrant, that means you're going to go to jail. Even if it's for a few hours, if it's for a few days or a few weeks, you're going to jail. With one policy change that we made are for the low-level nonviolent C, D, and E felonies here in Missouri, we're only issuing summons. There's no threat to the community. There's no victim that's being threatened. We issue summons and avoid that individual from having to go to jail in the first place, because we know even a short jail stay increases the likelihood that individual will come in on a different offense. And then last, something that I know, myself and Marilyn and Kim are advocates of, which I created in my office, are conviction integrity units. That's not in the rules. We don't have to do that. But I think that it's important that if we're going to lock people up, we have to have some safeguards in place to make sure that we got the right person and to address mistakes, whether they happened on my watch or in the past. And I'll add, and I think and as a former public defender and defense attorney, I think you all will agree, prosecutors' offices have historically been obstructionist toward those kind of efforts. And so what we've done with this unit is not going beyond just being obstructionist. We are actually being preemptive and looking for these cases. And I'm happy to say we just started this unit this year. I've only been in office a year and a half, and we were able to release a gentleman who had served 20 years based on a wrongful conviction that we brought to the Supreme Court. They agreed with us, and now he's free today. So I do agree with Natasha. We should not be considered progressive. This should be the norm. The only counter I would say to that is that we know we're not. And so I think we need to push the kind of reforms that will make this the norm, because I think we all can agree that that's the direction we should be going. Lower crime rates, not just lower crime rates, but lower jail population rates, which in St. Louis County, we've reduced by 30% since I've come in office.
There is so much that I'd like to follow up with Attorney Bell on, but we'll circle back to those things. But Natasha, how has the presence of a progressive prosecutor in the jurisdiction in which you serve, how has that changed things for your clients on a day-to-day basis? I realize that's a broad question, but you can please narrow it however you'd like. You've obviously worked in various areas of your office, including juvenile justice. Obviously, drug prosecutions are different from violent crime prosecutions. Can you give us an overview of how your practice has changed, or how your clients have been affected based on the presence of your progressive prosecutor there in Baltimore County? I'm sorry, Baltimore City for you, correct?
Yes. So I just a couple of points that really came to mind when Wesley was speaking. Number one, I always encourage people to be wary of the comparisons to other prosecutors, right? Because in terms of a prosecutor in a specific jurisdiction, your duty is to the community that you serve. How well you are doing your job is based upon the community that you serve. So for example, and I'll use a really benign example, the fact that you are arresting 5 individuals, for urinating in public, and another jurisdiction is arresting 50, does not necessarily make you a better prosecutor, because then again, we're like, why are we wasting resources and arresting people for urinating in public, right? So the constant comparison that I'm progressive because I'm doing more than someone else, I think is very very flawed. So I definitely want to put that out there, because we hear a great deal about that especially, and I will use Maryland because that is who I know. I've practiced in Baltimore City 24 years now. I've been through quite a few prosecutors. But in terms of, Maryland, the distinction with her, again, is the ability to communicate. When we have issues in the public defender's office, we're able to engage in a dialogue that we were not before. So in some ways that benefits the client. She does not necessarily, and most of the time, she does not really take into account everything that we present. But it is a dialogue that is important to the citizens of Baltimore City, because our clients are also citizens of Baltimore City, right? We often forget that the clients that we serve come to court in need of help, right? Those individuals are coming to court as a result of some sort of trauma, as a result of homelessness, as a result of poverty in some ways, as a result of lack of education, whatever it is, it's an opportunity for them to get, and they are seeking help. Often prosecutors are touted for things that us as insiders, and when I speak of us, the defense attorneys, know are like the obvious things. So like, for example, I'll give you an example. Recently, Maryland was touted in the news for dismissing approximately, I believe it was like 600 open warrants, right? And on its face, that seemed amazing. It seemed great. But the reality of it was cases that were minor traffic offenses, urinating in public, cases for which, arguably, that should have never been brought forth, number one. Cases that were years and years old at this point that the state was not able to, to prosecute, as well as the fact that when you have cases that have been open warrant status for that long, that begs the issue that, in fact, these persons have not been in trouble for that period of time, right? But again, she's touted in the media. It's a big headline in the newspaper. Marilyn Mosby's dismissing 600 open warrants. When the reality of it is, again, I go back to my baseline, those are cases that probably should have been dismissed long ago.
Is there any, Natasha, as a follow-up, Is there any, though, distinction, and do you applaud, for instance, the example that you just gave of the dismissal of 600 warrants? Would the prior prosecutor have done the same thing? And do you believe that a prosecutor who, in your situation, uses this as a point of reform, do you believe that that prosecutor deserves that credit, or do you believe that this is more of a political ploy, just as a notch in the belt, as it were, in order to have one's progressive bona fides? Like, is this realistically progression, is my question.
That's really a loaded question, and I say that primarily because the system in which that we function, we keep talking about reform, but the system in which we function, the current criminal justice system, was never established in any form to be a haven of safety for the Black and brown, right? So we keep talking about reforming. Actually, what we need to do is kind of an upheaval, right? Then we also talk about, Wesley spoke about kind of more tools in the toolbox. I mean, there are too many tools, right? Every year, when we talk about tools, it's like code name for us in Maryland are additional laws, right? There's so many laws on the books as it exists now, but that is not where the solutions will take place, right? It's about reallocating, resources to where the problems really exist. So, I think Maryland definitely seizes on opportunities, and that was an opportunity to essentially do her job, and we applaud her for that. And we encourage her to, continue to go along that course, because that is why the citizens of Baltimore elected her, right? The citizens of Baltimore didn't elect her just to kind of lock people up, because we already know that does not solve any problems. That does not lower any, crime rates. I mean, Maryland has the highest Maryland has the highest rate of incarceration of Black males between the ages of 18 to 24 in the United States. Number 2 is Mississippi. The state of Maryland has the highest incarceration rate of Black males 18 to 24, right? So we know that's not the solution to the problem. So there has to be, a shift. And as she continues to do these things of which the people elected her to do, because again, it's the entire community of Baltimore City, we definitely encourage her to continue on that path.
Thanks, Natasha. Marissa, I want you to address for us what changes you've seen in your jurisdiction based on the jurisdictions, rather, because I know that you represent defendants in multiple jurisdictions and you're dealing with multiple prosecutors. But for those such as Andrea Harrington, who've been touted as progressive, what are the real world effects that you've seen on your clients, if any, be it reasonable offers, be it diversion programs, be it the ability to sit down and have a conversation with the prosecutor, which, as Natasha just indicated, is frankly the more valuable change that some would note. Tell us your thoughts on that, Marissa.
I've definitely seen some improvement. I've seen some benefits for my client, for my clients, one thing I will say is that I agree with Natasha that, the low hanging fruit, these policies that have been announced that to not prosecute these minor crimes and to do diversions, they're valuable. They're important. It's good that we're doing them. They should have been a long time ago that's happened. I handle these, more serious cases, including murders. And I do have to say that the hard cases, those cases are really where you see, I think, if there is a real commitment to, thinking through the tough questions. And so I would say that I have seen some benefits for my clients. District Attorney Harrington has definitely been willing to talk with me about cases and to handle them on the merits. In some ways, though, the benefits that I see are those benefits also still flow to some of the easier clients in terms of who the clients are, in that they are young and the ones that have no prior record, and they, I don't know that I see much willingness to rethink my clients. This is not specifically about District Attorney Harrington. I want to specify that, but in general, I don't. While I see some movement, particularly around my younger clients, and looking for ways and being open to my arguments about ways about our approaches toward those clients. There still is a lot of resistance for my clients who are older, who have histories, criminal histories, particularly if they're crimes of violence. What's difficult is when I talked earlier about, I think a real, hallmark is a commitment to decarceration. I'm not just talking about 30-day sentences on minor crimes. I'm talking about a real commitment to think about restorative justice, a real commitment to think about what it means for victims and victims' families who are participating as in this process, and what their experience is like and what their expectations are out of the system, and it's hard. It's hard work for prosecutors to really meet that head on. And I will say, I do think it's in the quiet moments and it's in individual conversations because of the nature of my practice in the cases. But I do see some differences in that. And it's a stark contrast to what I see when I'm working with the prosecutors in Hampden County, which is the one that I said that I practice in, that is definitely not in any way a reform prosecutor. And frankly, with the U.S. Attorney's Office. On my federal cases, because I also do CJA. So that all is to say is, yes, there are benefits. The nature of my cases are such that it's quieter than some of these big sweeping policies that cut across and affect a large, sort of swath of people charged.
Thanks, Marissa. Attorney Bell, you mentioned before, and I said I would get back to this, the expansion of diversion programs in your jurisdiction that you spearheaded. Were there diversion programs prior to you taking office? And have you created, I guess you love numbers, so I'll say it this way. What is the percentage of growth of those diversion programs, and what areas do they specifically address? Without getting into each program, of course. Which areas do they address, and do they at the end of the day affect those numbers in terms of the reduction of incarcerated people in your county?
So what we had before that I came into office was a diversion program for the sake of saying we have a diversion program. But going back to your data, St. Louis County, or my point about data, is St. Louis County is 1 million people. My predecessor had a docket for mental health that consisted of 19 people total. We know that 85% or 70 to 80% of people who come in contact with the justice system are in need of mental health care. There were literally 19 people in that program. The drug diversion program had 72, and we're talking about a county of 1 million. And so what we've decided to do is not just, and this goes to Marissa's point, is that the diversion programs under my predecessor were by and large just targeted to the 18 to 25-year-old demographic. We've opened that up, and we allow anyone into our diversion program. And unlike our predecessor, and like my predecessor, we don't require an admission of guilt, which discourages a lot of people from getting the help that oftentimes that they need. And we make our diversion when we, as much as possible when appropriate, pre-charge as opposed to pre-plea. to try and avoid with certain individuals the even being actually charged with the program. And that's something that we get criticized from law enforcement. We get accused of being too soft on crime. And so all I would say is I would just caution those who believe in these types of reforms to, just keep some perspective, because I think that these reforms are important. And again, the data is clear. We've decreased the jail population in St. Louis County by 30%. That's been a partnership working with the bench as well as the public defenders and defense counsel. But the prosecutor's office prior to us coming in was always the deal breaker that would keep people in, keep nonviolent low-level offenders in. And so in addition to those specific things, it's those larger policy changes. I'm not going to get into an anecdotal argument about individual cases, because there's times we're just going to disagree on fact patterns. But as far as our policies are concerned, that is a sea change. And if you don't want to compare it to other jurisdictions, I mean, that's fair. But I think that whenever you're assessing what you're doing, you have to look at what other places are doing. That was a lesson learned from Ferguson. And I'm sorry, I missed some of the other comments, so I can't respond to those.
No, I think we appreciate your response was thorough. I want to shift gears a bit, and I want to talk about resources in general. I know that where I am in Cook County, Illinois, where Kim Fox, our progressive prosecutor, has done many of the things that Wesley just indicated in terms of what he's doing in St. Louis County. She's up for re-election. She survived a primary challenge, and we don't have a notable Republican Party in Chicago, so she will win the election coming up. But one of the issues that we've had practicing here is that there's a difference between the ideas often that the prosecutors will tout in terms of things like restorative justice, diversion programs, and the resources to actually get those things done. Natasha, I'd like to speak to you about that. Have you found, first of all, any sort of expansion of diversion programming, restorative justice programming, and whether or not with that expansion, there's actually services in place? Because we recognize that some of those services are outside of the control of the prosecutor's office in these jurisdictions, and they rely on other politicians to make those services available. So are you finding in your jurisdiction, first of all, if there's an expansion of those programs and the practical reality of actually having your clients participate in programming that may save them a conviction, jail time, and other ruination to their lives?
So in Baltimore City, we do have various diversion, quote unquote, programs, but most of them are in the form of post pleas. So for example, we have a mental health court, we have drug treatment court, we have veterans court. So we have these special courts that will look to serve the needs of our specific needs of our clients. We also have community-based programs, such as one of my favorite programs is the Center for Urban Families. When Marilyn came into office, she added an additional program known to Aim to Be More, but that is specifically targeted to primarily first-time drug offenders. So in our jurisdiction, we do have various diversion programs, but most of them are, I would say, funded through the courts. What the challenges that we find in terms of resources to the state's attorney's office, so they will get resources for various different initiatives and developing additional programming. The challenge that we have at the public defender's office, we will not get equal resources, right? So for example, the court wants to open up another, some sort of diversion court, prostitution court. which then, the prosecutor's office will get funding for additional prosecutors, but then they need a counterpart, right? They need the public defenders to essentially man the courts. But the problem that we find is that we won't get additional resources to hire additional attorneys to fund on our side. So those are the challenges that we face in terms of different funding. And that's how it usually implicates us.
Is there a distinction between diversion programs and restorative justice programming, or do you find them to fall under the same umbrella?
I think there's a lot of overlap. In Maryland, we passed the Justice Restorative Act, which essentially addresses or seeks to address a lot of the issues. Like, for example, it looks in terms of individuals who are like on probation for drug offenses. It takes a more graduated look in terms of sanctions and as to like violations of probations, understanding that drug addiction is essentially a disease, right? I also would say that in terms of diversion and the growth of diversion programs, especially in Maryland, is more so like the sign of the times, right? As people come to a greater understanding, like for example, that drug addiction is a disease, you'll find more prosecutors at least are leaning more towards, placing persons in treatment versus straight out incarcerating them, right? So I don't know if that's necessarily a product of the leadership or just the general understanding of the nature of the disease at this time. And then, you also fall into what is mandated at the top and what really happens on the front line is not always the same thing, right? Sometimes things are said on high, but by the time it gets to the front line and how it's actually executed in court, it doesn't really play out in the same ways. And that's for good and a lot of times for bad.
Realizing, Mr. Bell, and I'm going to go directly to Leslie now, and I'll come back to you, Marissa. Realizing that you still maintain, well, I'll ask you this. Do you still maintain similar staffing or those attorneys working for your office? Are they the same people who worked for your predecessor? And if that is true, is there resistance to a lot of the reforms that you have implemented in your office?
And also, Tony, do I get a chance to respond to the resources question too?
I would like you to talk about whatever you'd like to talk about.
Man, I appreciate
it. So please go ahead. This is a fascinating discussion and I do not want to limit it. Please go ahead.
I appreciate it. And so first I want to preface this by saying Missouri is a solid red state. So keep that in mind as I talk about some of the things that I'm going to talk about. And I could not agree more. The funding for public defenders, and I say this as a former public defender, is abhorrent. We have no problems as a society locking people up, but then those individuals that we need to make certain that individuals get their constitutional rights, those funds get continually decreased. And they came to a head in Missouri. The public defender's office has been so poorly funded the last decade that the public defenders filed a lawsuit to get some relief, to say, hey, we either need more funding or we're going to have to get the private bar to help take some of these cases. I think that's probably similar to what goes on, Marissa, in your jurisdiction, that some private attorneys are contracted to handle public defender cases. And that's not the case here because there was no funding for it. And so my predecessor obviously opposed that lawsuit and appealed it and wanted to interview and wanted the court to interview every public defender to get every public defender's individual caseload because their caseloads were too high. And obviously I came in office and we withdrew that objection, and as a unit with the public defenders working with them, we worked on a plan together. And I think that goes to Natasha's points of what is good for your individual jurisdiction. And so with respect to resources though, and I'll do this as quickly as I can. We've expanded our diversion programs and we've got no budget help to do it because my predecessor had one person handling all the diversion programs, and that person was only part-time because they still had a caseload which included murder trials as well. So effectively there was no diversion programs. I think total you had about 150 people in it. So we expanded that, and I had to take people from other units, and we're one of the lower funded prosecutors' offices of large cities in the country. So I had to take individuals from other units and create our diversion program. And so now we have four people in there, two attorneys, because I believe that your budget decisions reflect your values. And so we had to rob Peter to pay Paul, but I think Paul is important in this particular equation. Our integrity unit. I think this is a very important unit where we look at old cases to make certain that there weren't wrongful convictions, but also we use that walled off unit to investigate allegations of public corruption as well as police use of force or police misconduct, because we want to have a walled off unit that doesn't deal with law enforcement. And we hired a young lady from the Department of Justice, and she prosecuted law enforcement officers for the Department of Justice. That was her job. But we didn't get any additional budget for that as well. We took attorneys from other units that are now have less staff. But again, I think that those reflect your values. And so with our diversion program, what we did was, after the election, before I took office, we reached out to our community organizations, and we teamed up with over 40 community partners, one being Affinia Healthcare, Places for People, who deals with mental health care, the Urban League Father Support Center, so we could offer more options to judges or for us when we are determining what to do with an individual. Because oftentimes with mental health, judges are in a quandary where they want to release the guy, but they're afraid because he has mental health issues, he's going to come right back. Well, now we have Places for People and other organizations where we say, Judge, no, we've got a place to send this person that they'll actually get treatment as opposed to just being sent to a jail cell. And then your last question, and I can do this one quick, I promise, Tony, the resistance. See, we have what are called civil service rules here in St. Louis County. So I don't have carte blanche to just hire people and bring my people in. You can only remove people for cause. And so there's a few that I did have cause, and we were able to get rid of some people early and hire more people, and it's public service. So obviously there's going to be turnover, but early on it was a change in culture. And I'll say Marilyn was one of the people who kind of advised me that, hey, it often takes 6 months to a year to start seeing that change. And we wanted to give people an opportunity to get on board with our policies. And one thing that we do to try and get away from because we know we can't look over everyone's shoulder, because I think Natasha made an excellent point that sometimes those policies aren't being adhered to by your line prosecutor. But we've made it clear to defense counsel, to the judges, to everyone, not only can you bring your complaints up the chain, we encourage it. And if our line prosecutors have a problem with that, they can go kick rocks or they can go somewhere else, because we want to know that these policies are being implemented. Because yes, we still do have some people, a lot of people who were from the last administration, but we have a lot of new people, and we're seeing that change, that culture change. But it takes a lot of, you got to look over people's shoulders as much as you can, and be willing to go to them and say, look, this was wrong, we're going to correct it, and you just got to deal with it.
Thanks, Wesley. I want to direct this next question to Marissa, and I'd like to have our other panelists chime in as well. Have you found impediments or roadblocks to progression, either Wesley as a prosecutor, and certainly Natasha and Marissa as defense counsel? Have you found obstruction to agreed upon, or these joint kind of progressive solutions to cases, have you found obstruction by those men and women in black robes? Have the judges been on board with, or have they been obstructing some of these attempts to change things?
I mean, there's definitely some examples in Massachusetts. Rachel Rollins, of course, is obviously in this conversation, and she,
Tell us who Rachel Rollins is. I think some may not know, may not be familiar with her name. She's been pretty popular lately, but go ahead and tell us who she is.
So Rachel Rollins is the elected district attorney in Suffolk County, which is Boston in Massachusetts. So I'm not out there. She is the first. She is the first Black woman prosecutor elected in Massachusetts. We do not have a proud history of diversity amongst our elected officials at all levels, but she's out there in Boston. And absolutely, she encountered, there were protests, and police were, rounding people up and bringing them in, bringing people in charged with, disturbing the peace kinds of charges and things like that associated with the right to protest. And her office wanted to, they were seeking to dismiss people's, dismiss the charges prior to arraignment. And there was a judge who wasn't accepting it. And she petitioned to the SJC, the Supreme Judicial Court, and immediately. So, so there's like sort of kind of high profile versions of that, for sure, that are kind of more systemic. And she really had to go to the mat to assert her, her authority and her discretion as a prosecutor. And this SJC went her way. She also, and I don't want to say too much about this because my law partners are involved with this case, but just this last couple of weeks, there's a case that's out of Suffolk County and that's up in the Supreme Judicial Court, and 4 white male elected prosecutors from 4 different counties sought, without any kind of precedent or legal authority, to intervene, basically kind of, I guess, because, their assertion was that she wasn't going to represent the interests of the Commonwealth, appropriately. And she wrote, personally signed and wrote a scathing pleading in response that is still up with the SJC. So it's certainly the case. And I kind of think that the more out of the box a prosecutor is, and the more outspoken they are, particularly against law enforcement, I see the pushback, and I definitely see the pushback.
Thank you, Marissa. Natasha, what has been your experience with the same? I know that several years ago, after Freddie Gray, and after that prosecution, there was, at least we heard nationally, a lot of pushback to Marilyn Mosby and her initiatives because of the Boys in Blue. What has been your experience with any type of obstruction or pushback to any progressive reforms from judges and those other stakeholders?
Mm-hmm. So there's definitely been pushback from various stakeholders along the way, right? You hear it's pretty well known in terms of the Baltimore City Police, the department currently under consent decree for their egregious acts of what I call terrorism against the citizens of Baltimore City for years and years. There, I would say, pretty much non-existent relationship between the state's attorney's office and the police department makes it difficult for us from the defense point of view, just in terms of getting information, in terms of discovery, in terms of being able to defend our clients. There's that. I would say there's obstructions within the state's attorney's office. I don't know if it's willful ignorance. There are times that there are certain positive mandates that Maryland has publicly made that line attorneys will go contrary to. And that's when, social media is, the media is great, right? Because Maryland would have done a press conference and we come in without the transcript or sometimes, on a cell phone, trying to press the prosecutor to do what Maryland has just announced that she's doing, and the line prosecutor refuses, right? In those incidents, the court has been an aid in that, turns to Mr. Prosecutor. Oh, Mr. Prosecutor, that is the policy of your office, is it not? And, very often than not, there's a continuance so they can kind of figure it out, right? There's been instances, like, for example, I believe it was when the GTTF, the Gun Trace Task Force, that all came down, and we essentially provided the state's attorney's office with a list of individuals that we were seeking the immediate reversal of the conviction, right? The state had the opportunity, and they did. They went and they pretty much, they dwindled down the list to what they deemed were appropriate. And the defense and the state went before the court, and the court was like, well, you don't have the authority to do that. So essentially, as various stakeholders in conjunction with the state's attorney's office, we then went to the legislature so then they could devise a motion to vacate for those circumstances that existed when later on it was determined that these were wrongful convictions, and that there would be a more speedy way in which to resolve those issues. So there's been various roadblocks along the way that makes progress incredibly slow. It definitely requires you to kind of constantly be on alert, the constant of sharing information, because like I said, it could be announced this morning, and luck would have it, you have that case this afternoon, and you would think, Maryland announces to her staff before she goes to a press conference. And generally, we feel like as a public defender's office, they're not really trying to share information unless they absolutely have to. So there's various roadblocks along the way that makes progress slow. But we just keep pushing. That's all you can do. We are zealous advocates, and we are constantly pushing.
Wesley, I think you could speak to this issue as well, obviously. To the extent that you can share, and we recognize that you're an elected official, so we're not baiting you to trash anyone. We simply want to know what the impediments are to your agenda as it regards some of your initiatives.
Yeah, there are, and let's just call it what it is. And that's why, whether you want to use the label or not, there are certain prosecutors generally who are reform-minded or advocates of these policies, and we will see law enforcement diametrically opposed to these individuals. It's not just a coincidence that it's not Maryland's personality that the Baltimore Police Department has just been opposed to her. Even common sense things like diversion programs and things of that nature. It's not a coincidence that the type of vehemence that we see against Rachel Rollins, who I know well and is a friend as well, Kim Gardner in the city. That's not just a coincidence. Even myself, I've seen it to a certain extent as well. I will say, as far as the bench goes, I've been fortunate. Our bench has been very over for the most part, very supportive of the things that we've done, and we made a point to reach out to them and let them know that the direction that we're going into. And I have a presiding judge who was the limited diversion programs we had. He was the one who created the alternative courts prior to, but again, my office prior to me was resistant to it, so there wasn't much he could do about it. And well, now he's the presiding judge, and so we have a very good relationship, and that's helped us expand these programs. But I would say, and I want to make sure that I'm being clear, the biggest detriment or the biggest roadblock or hurdle that we've had has not been law enforcement. It's been more of the FOP. And I know some, there's different jurisdictions that have different issues. Sometimes it's with law enforcement, but we made a point to reach out, and I have 55 police departments, so that makes that a whole other issue within itself. But we've made a point to reach out to every department. We work with them. We created an advisory committee so we can talk to them. And sometimes I got to give them bad news, but I think they appreciate hearing it. But the FOP, which is different, obviously, we're talking the police unions, those are the ones who generally are not police officers for the most part. Their leadership are not. And they're the ones that you'll see with doing the most obstruction, like literally not just being inaccurate in their assessment of things that we're doing, but outright lying about things that we're doing. But I just want to reiterate that I just think it's important to understand that someone like Marilyn, someone like Rachel Rowland, someone like myself, we are already getting it from those traditional establishment sides. And I just think it's important for, especially who I consider my brothers and sisters in the public defender's office, to understand that we are pushing for these reforms. We are advocating for these reforms. It may not always roll out as smoothly as we'd like to, but I consider public defenders as allies, and we're going to work together. We're going to argue about individual cases, but as far as those policies, I think we all agree in the direction that we're trying to go in. Those prosecutors that, including myself, that I would consider reform, progressive-minded prosecutors, are the small percentage of prosecutors who are doing these things.
I am going to now, thank you, Wesley. I'm going to now shift for the remainder of our program and attempt to address questions that are coming in from.
Tony, before you shift, can I just make an ask?
Please. Yes, ma'am.
I would especially, Wesley has identified himself as an ally of public defenders. I would make an ask of you as an ally of public defenders and all those who say they're allies of public defenders that, a significant, prosecutors have a significant role in effectuating change in the criminal justice system. We speak a great deal about the police, but prosecutors have a significant role because they make the decisions in terms of what cases will go forward. I would say that as a prosecutor, you also have the ability to kind of, pull back the curtain, right? We have these officers that have multiple incidents of misconduct. You have the power to basically pull back that curtain. And as an ally of public defenders, I would ask that you take on that task of essentially being more transparent. I can't think of any other job in which you would have 10, 20, 30 misconducts and you would still be on the job, right? That is just totally unheard of. So as an ally of the public defender's office, I would ask you and other prosecutors to take that on that task of essentially pulling back that shield and revealing those officers, especially those that have records of misconduct.
Can I
and if I can
quickly, okay.
Sure. Why don't you respond, Wesley, and then I think Marissa has a comment as well.
First and foremost, and I know that was a more generalized statement, but those are the things that we're doing in our office. On day one, we changed our internal policies on cash bail and advocated to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court changed those cash bail rules in the state of Missouri. Our diversion program, which was our smallest unit, is now by far our largest unit when you look at the caseloads, because we are allowing more people into the diversion than has ever been than has happened in St. Louis County in my jurisdiction. And when we find officers that lie to us, they don't have to get to the point of 20 to 30 misconducts. When we find that an officer lies to us, and I've done this several times this year already, not only do we turn that information over to the public defender, the attorneys, public defenders, the defense attorneys, as we're supposed to. But we know that there's a lot of offices that try to hide that ball. No, we turn that information over, and we also have on several occasions let departments know that there are individuals we're not going to accept cases from. We can't fire them because they don't work for us, but we're not going to accept cases from. So I agree with that. And it's not being an ally to the public defender, it's being an ally and adhering to justice. And that's the way that I approach it. As far as allying with the public defenders, it's with respect to advocating for the resources that they need. I am been very vocal that our state legislature needs to give them the funding that they need to be able to do their job effectively, and those other things that they need.
Very good. Thank you, Wesley. Marissa, you had a comment as well on that last piece.
Well, I just wanted to add that I find it interesting, and I appreciate Wesley that you're a data guy, and that's your and that tends to be your perspective. I think to draw on what Natasha said is in terms of turning over of evidence around law enforcement and things like that. I mean, one thing that every prosecutor's office is in a unique place to do is it's not just sort of the access to the internal records of police departments and law enforcement and what you know in the context of that. It is also at the fingertips of the prosecutors in a way that it never is to the defense bar to say, not only do I know the officer has been found misconduct, but every time they've not been found credible by a judge, every time that a case has been thrown out. And I do appreciate that is something that you work toward internally. I know that you don't have the power, and no prosecutor has the power to step in and do anything in particular about a law enforcement officer that their department won't do anything about. But the position is incredibly unique, not just in the discretion and the choices that you have, but in the ability to assimilate that data and to run across. I mean, in where I practice and comparing to other defense attorneys, across the country, it seems obviously willful, if not in your office, but the tradition is, or the culture has been to hide that, has been to go out of your way to not only to not tell defense attorneys, but to not collect the information at all and not make it accessible for anybody to collect. So I think it's a really important point that Natasha raised, and speaks a lot to the culture of what it might mean to be a reform prosecutor. So
I could not agree more. I think that, and that's the point that I was making, is that most offices are doing that. You're right. They're not sharing that information. They're trying to hide the ball. And when we came in, we had prosecutors who were also of that mind. And there's always the subtleties, that gray area where they can justify it. And so we continue to reiterate that we have open files. If you have it, turn it over. If we can't prosecute the case based with the information, which is our duty to provide, if we can't prosecute it based on the evidence and sharing that evidence like we're supposed to, then we don't need to. Then we shouldn't be prosecuting that individual. But you are right, and across the country, it's not happening. But that goes to my point, is that when you see offices that are trying to just keep that perspective, that there's a lot of, you're being pulled in a lot of different directions. And with us, one slip up and we have the FOP and their media machines putting out information saying, oh, well, the crime rate is up here. We had and I'll say this quick, with COVID, the courts have been essentially continuing everything. We just had a reporter send a media request saying, why are your convictions down? Well, because there hasn't been court. But that's the stuff that we have to deal with, who are identified as reform or progressive minded.
Thank you, Wesley. We probably have about 10 minutes left, a little bit less. So I do want to address a couple questions that have been sent my way. One of the questions, and I'll just ask the question generally and have each of you comment on this from your perspectives. Marissa, you mentioned earlier that some of the areas that you work in are less diverse. You work in some urban areas and you work in some suburban areas that are less diverse. Do you find, according to the questioner here, do you find that these reforms are impeded or advanced by the diversity of the staffing of various prosecutor offices? Do you find that to be a relevant factor in moving forward with progressive reforms? Marissa, we'll start with you.
I don't think I can really answer that. I don't think either of the district attorney's offices that I think of when I think of where reform is happening, they have no diversity. They are the widest places you could ever imagine.
Are they prosecuting brown and black defendants? These offices?
Yes, yes. It is still yes. Certainly disproportionate to their to the sort of the demographics of the community. I mean, just like anywhere else, there's still over prosecution of people of color. The communities themselves are, as I said, not very diverse. I mean, one thing that's interesting is that the county south of me is Springfield, Massachusetts, which some of you might know is the police department, the only police department that the Trump administration saw fit to open a civil patterns and practice investigation of. It's incredibly corrupt police department. Much more diverse. The district attorney's staff down there is more diverse. Some degree of this, sort of evolution of thinking around mental health and addiction has necessarily, I think, resulted both in terms of their staff, not because of policy, any sort of state of policy, and also the way the judges are treating things. Some reform, some benefits, an evolved way of thinking, that are results for clients that I see down there. In some ways, up in Berkshire County, I think it remains an open question. Absent the data, absent Attorney Harrington or District Attorney Sullivan here making the data available to say, for us to really know what the breakdown is in terms of prosecution of people of color and how it relates to the, the community at large. I don't know how they could make the case that they are dealing with the over prosecution, of people of color. It's really still happening and in disproportionate numbers. I guess I also would add, it's always worth asking if one thing that Andrea Harrington has been good about in the cases that I've had and what I've seen is she really is tackling better dispositions and really thinking through, what should happen with young people who are charged. And I can't help but wonder if that looks different for her than when she's dealing with white, for the most part, young people, than it might look for Rachel Rollins in Boston, or if we did ever get a reform-minded prosecutor in Hampden County, what it would look like for that person. And I think that's an open question unless there's a real commitment to looking at the data and sharing this information, being, kind of opening your books across different jurisdictions and different DA's offices.
Thanks, Marissa. Same question briefly for you, Natasha. Has there been, or do you have an opinion regarding the diversity of the prosecutor's office in your jurisdiction, and if there's sufficient diversity in your view and if that diversity affects the agenda of the prosecutor for progressive reforms and actions?
Well, there's absolutely not sufficient diversity. There's not even sufficient diversity in the legal profession. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, 2017 statistics had the legal profession as 85% white, 67% male. 85% white, and I believe 67% male. So in that of itself, there is a lacking of diversity. I really can't speak to the numbers in the state's attorney's office. all I can say is just by observation over the years, I have seen more people of color and more women prosecutors in the office.
Mr. Bell, same question for you. You actually have some power in this regard, so tell us what you think.
I think that diversity is our superpower, but every superpower has its weakness. Superman has his kryptonite, right? And so I think that if we're diversity for the sake of diversity, you're right. You're not going to get the outcomes that you're looking for. But when you have the mission-oriented people and at that layer of diversity, I've sat at the tables where decisions have been made, and having that influence had a direct influence on the final decision, because people can relate. There's, African Americans, we have a different have different experiences. Women have different experiences. White folks have different experiences, and bringing those things to the table, and even in charging decisions makes a difference. And what I've seen is in just the culture of our office, and we still, I'm only a year and a half in, but I've made a point to bring more diversity to our office. And as a result, there's just more sharing of ideas and sharing of experiences, and those who resisted the diversion saying, oh, you're just being soft. All you're doing is helping defendants. Well, then what we talked about was, do you realize that many of our defendants are also victims? And when you look at that pool and understanding that, and a lot of our career prosecutors, they never even thought about that. And I think that it brings different experiences, it brings different perspectives to the table. And I just think it's just so important.
There is a question, and this I'm assuming will be the last one, but I'll start with you, Wesley. There's a question regarding implicit bias. I know we've talked about prosecutors' offices in terms of culture. This may fall under that same umbrella, but you would know better than I. Do you find a inherent implicit bias in those prosecutors who don't happen to look like many of the people that they're prosecuting, regarding the choices that they make as to diversion, as to reasonable outcome? Is there an implicit bias, and is that bias based on race alone, or is it based on the larger culture of crime and punishment? And I'm smiling because
the answer is absolutely. And so I've taught implicit bias classes with some colleagues of mine, and to be fair, everyone has their biases. We know that everyone does. But with respect to prosecutors, absolutely you see those biases play out. And when you have, in my position, I'm in a position where I can do something about it in my office, but I've seen the sea change from my predecessor and how prosecutors would approach particular cases and look at particular defendants. And I'll say, for example, if you had a victim who was a drug addict, I just saw the difference in the recommendations that prosecutors would want to make. They would not take those cases as seriously. I remember a particular case where it was a homicide, and the prosecutor, who had been here for 15 years or more, wanted to charge it as a murder second and couldn't justify it other than the fact that the victim was not the most reputable person in the world. But our position is that everyone has a right to their life, and everyone has a right to have a voice. And even if there's no family members or no one in the community that will speak for this particular victim, we will. And so we charged it as murder first. But that also had a lot to do with the diversity that was in the room. To say, hey, well, we had this case and we charged it as murder first, so why aren't we doing this one? What's different about this? And oftentimes, as we know, it's implicit bias because people don't realize it. And that's why I think that type of training is so important, not just for prosecutors and police officers, but for everyone, particularly in our country when we look at the current climate and the history of this country. So yes, I think it does have a lot to do, not just, but a lot to do with race, because that has a lot to do with your experiences, and most of us can't see beyond our own circumstances. And I think that kind of training helps us put those things in perspective and put ourselves in other people's shoes.
Thank you, Wesley. I think we're going to have to wrap it here, and I'll give Wesley the last word on that, since he can actually do something about it. And so we appreciate your participation, first of all, Wesley, in this forum. It's rather unique in that we have a prosecutor as a part of a conversation largely among defense attorneys, and it has been very illuminating, so thank you for that. As always, Marissa, always love when we talk. I get to see you, and I'll hopefully see you soon. And Natasha, it has been a pleasure getting to meet you, and thank you all for your participation. I'll turn the program back over to Ms. Milton.
Thank you, Tony. On behalf of NACDL and APA, I want to thank our panelists, our moderator, and viewers for joining us in this spirited discussion. The recording for this program and all programs in this series will be available in NACDL's Resource Center. By now, you should have received a survey which we'd ask you to complete and help improve our programming. There's a QR code that will allow you to hold your camera up and will take you directly to the survey. Thank you, and we look forward to you joining us for our third installment, Navigating System Change from a Community Perspective, tomorrow at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.